Welcome to Shadow Frames, where forgotten images reveal their darkest secrets. Among the countless photographs that document our history, some capture more than just a moment in time. They freeze anomalies that defy explanation. Today, we examine one such photograph, a graduation ceremony from 1911. The sepia-toned image shows rows of young women in white dresses, their faces solemn yet proud as they stand perfectly arranged on the steps of Glendale Women's Academy. Their graduation caps sit uniformly atop carefully styled hair, and each holds a rolled diploma tied with ribbon. The photograph appears unremarkable at first glance, a standard commemoration of academic achievement from the Edwardian era, but upon closer inspection, an unsettling detail emerges. In the back row, slightly off-center, stands a woman different from the students. Her clothing identifies her as one of the instructors, Professor Eleanor Winters, according to the ceremony program that accompanied the photograph. Her face appears slightly blurred compared to the others, as though she moved during the prolonged exposure. Yet according to multiple accounts, including the photographer's notes and 3 newspaper reports from the following day, Professor Winters had collapsed and died of heart failure nearly 40 minutes before this photograph was taken. The ceremony had been temporarily halted. Screens were placed around her body until medical personnel could discreetly remove her from the premises. The school director, after consulting with several prominent families in attendance, made the controversial decision to continue the graduation once the professor's body had been taken away. "These young women have worked too hard for this moment to be denied them completely," the director was quoted as saying in the Glendale Herald. The photographer's logbook contains a curious notation beside this image. Final class photograph taken at 4:22 p.m. All remaining faculty and graduates present. No mention of anything unusual during the shoot. No acknowledgement of the impossibility captured on film. Even more disturbing are the handwritten accounts from 3 graduates who, years later, claimed that during the photograph, they felt an unusual cold spot exactly where Professor Winters appears in the image. One wrote, "I felt her there, standing behind me, though I had watched them carry her away under a sheet not an hour before." The academy closed permanently just 3 years later after a series of unexplained incidents. Local records indicate that 7 of the 28 graduates pictured died within 18 months of the ceremony, all from different causes, yet all described as sudden and unexpected. What makes this photograph particularly unsettling is not just the apparent appearance of a dead woman among the living, but the expressions on the faces of the graduates in her immediate vicinity. While most students maintain pleasant if serious expressions, the 5 young women closest to Professor Winters display unmistakable discomfort, wide eyes, rigid postures, and what appears to be genuine fear. Was this merely a photographic anomaly? A double exposure, perhaps? Or did something inexplicable occur on those academy steps on that warm June afternoon in 1911? A photograph can lie, yet what it shows us may still be true. This contradiction haunts the Glendale Academy graduation image of 1911, compelling me to investigate further. After examining public records and private journals, I've uncovered disturbing details that the local newspapers deliberately omitted. Professor Winters had been a controversial figure at the academy. Her progressive teaching methods and outspoken support for women's suffrage had created tension with the school's conservative administration. Several letters between board members revealed discussions about terminating her position just weeks before her death. One particularly telling note from Board Chairman Harrington stated, "Miss Winters' radical notions are poisoning the minds of impressionable young ladies who should be focused on domestic virtues, not political agitation." The ceremony itself was held during an unseasonable cold spell. Attendees noted that despite the June date, the air on the steps felt winter crisp, according to one parent's diary. The graduates had initially refused to continue with commencement after Professor Winters' collapse, but were ultimately coerced by threats that their diplomas would be withheld. I tracked down Evelyn Pierce, one of the few surviving graduates, now in her 127th year. Though her memory fades on recent events, her recollection of that day remains startlingly vivid. "We knew something was wrong with her that morning," Pierce whispered during our interview. Eleanor, Professor Winters, had been coughing blood into her handkerchief. When I expressed concern, she gripped my arm and said, "They won't let me finish what I started, but I'll see you all graduate regardless." Pierce's hands trembled as she continued. During the photograph, I felt her cold fingers on my shoulder. The photographer saw nothing unusual through his lens. but we felt her presence. The 5 of us closest to her had been members of her secret suffrage society. We'd taken an oath in her classroom after hours. The academy never knew. Most disturbing are the sealed medical reports I discovered in county archives. Professor Winter's official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the examining physician noted unusual contusions around the neck and questioned whether her death was entirely natural. No investigation followed. The 7 graduates who died in the following 18 months shared another connection beyond their education. All had continued Professor Winter's political activities after graduation. Their death certificates show varying causes: influenza, accidental drowning, unexpected hemorrhage, brain fever, household accident, nervous collapse, and unexplained consumption. Yet photographs of 6 of these women show the same strange blur around their faces that marked Professor Winters in the graduation image. The academy's closure came after a fire destroyed most of the East Wing, specifically the classrooms where Professor Winters had taught. Investigators found the charred remains of suffragette literature and meeting notes hidden beneath floorboards. The Glendale Women's Academy building still stands, converted now into luxury apartments. Current residents report unexplained cold spots on the staircase where the graduation photo was taken, and the faint sound of a woman's voice sometimes echoes through the halls, seemingly reciting the suffragette pledge, "Our votes shall be heard in this life or beyond." The Academy's archives yielded one final troubling artifact, a letter written by Professor Winters the morning of her death. I discovered it pressed between the pages of a first-edition copy of Vindication of the Rights of Woman in the school's abandoned library annex, a building spared from both the fire and subsequent renovations. "Should anything befall me," she wrote in a hand that grew increasingly unsteady, "know that our cause cannot be silenced. 28 souls have pledged themselves under my guidance. Through them, our voice will echo into the future, whether the men who rule this institution wish it or not." The photograph has degraded over the decades, yet curiously, while the images of many graduates have faded almost to transparency, Professor Winters' figure has remained unnaturally clear, even as the paper yellows and cracks around her. Former students who survived beyond the 18-month period reported recurring dreams of Professor Winters leading them up an endless staircase. The 5 young women positioned nearest to her in the photograph, Evelyn Pierce among them, formed a charitable foundation that discreetly funded suffrage activities across the state. Their official charter, filed in 1913, lists exactly 28 founding members, though 7 were already deceased by that point. Court records reveal that Headmaster Glenville, who made the decision to continue the ceremony, died exactly 1 year later during another graduation event. Witnesses described him clutching his throat before collapsing in a manner eerily similar to Professor Winters. The medical examiner noted unprecedented rigidity of the deceased and temperature readings significantly below what would be expected, even accounting for postmortem cooling. The photographer responsible for capturing the infamous image, Thomas Harker, abandoned his profession shortly afterward. His journal, recovered from his grandson's attic, contains a single entry regarding the incident. "I developed plates to reveal truth, but today I glimpsed something beyond truth. She wasn't there, yet the camera captured her. What else might exist between the worlds of seen and unseen? I cannot trust my eyes, nor my lens any longer." When the Academy building underwent renovation in 1956, workers discovered a sealed compartment beneath the graduation stairs. Inside was a suffragette banner and a collection of 28 white ribbons, each bearing the name of a graduate from that fateful ceremony. The ribbon belonging to Evelyn Pierce contained a barely perceptible inscription along its edge: "We stand together still." Most compelling is the testimony of Henrietta Caldwell, the Academy's longtime groundskeeper, who maintained the property long after its educational purpose had ended. In a recorded interview from 1962, she claimed, "Every year on graduation day, you can hear them assembling on those steps. The temperature drops sudden-like, and there's the rustling of white dresses. No matter how bright the sun, that staircase falls into shadow at precisely 4:22. I've seen them sometimes, not with my eyes exactly, but I've seen them." 29 women, standing proud, with Miss Winters at the center, not at the back where she stood in life, but at the very center. Glass plate negatives thought to have been destroyed in the 1956 renovations resurfaced last month in a forgotten storage room beneath what was once the Academy's photography studio. Among them, I discovered 3 additional exposures taken immediately after the infamous graduation photograph, images never printed or published. The first shows the same arrangement of graduates, yet Professor Winters appears to have shifted position, moving 1 step closer to the center. In the second plate, her figure has become more distinct, while 3 of the 7 graduates who would soon die have begun to blur at their edges. The third negative is most disturbing. Professor Winters stands fully centered, her previously solemn expression replaced with what can only be described as triumph, while the 28 graduates have arranged themselves in a peculiar pattern that, when viewed from above, suggests a ballot box. The current owner of the property granted me rare access to the staircase where the photographs were taken. While documenting the site, my recording equipment captured a woman's voice at a frequency just below normal human hearing. Audio enhancement revealed words spoken in unison, what audiologists confirmed to be 29 distinct voices reciting, "They may silence our tongues, but never our will. They may claim our bodies, but never our souls. We stand eternal witness to injustice." More alarming still is what I found in medical examiner Gordon Phillips's private journals. The official report mentioned contusions on Professor Winters' neck, but Phillips's personal notes described them in disturbing detail. Markings consistent with strangulation, yet arranged in a pattern suggesting deliberate placement. 5 distinct pressure points forming what appears to be a star. Have never witnessed such in 23 years of practice. I cross-referenced attendance records with staff schedules and discovered that Headmaster Glenville requested a private meeting with Professor Winters just 30 minutes before the ceremony began. His assistant noted that Winters emerged looking ashen and unsteady, yet proceeded to her place among the faculty. The photograph continues to change. When viewed under ultraviolet light, 28 thin lines become visible, connecting Professor Winters to each graduate. The conservator who assisted me, a woman with no knowledge of the photograph's history, refused to handle it after her initial examination, claiming she felt 29 sets of eyes watching from within the paper itself. Of the 28 graduates, only 7 have marked graves. The remaining 21 were reportedly cremated, yet funeral home records show no evidence of these cremations ever occurring. Property records reveal that the land surrounding the academy was purchased by Evelyn Pierce's foundation in 1923 and has remained undeveloped despite numerous lucrative offers from real estate investors. Most unsettling is the anonymous package I received yesterday containing a white ribbon identical to those found in the sealed compartment. Attached was a newspaper clipping announcing the upcoming centenary of women's suffrage, with a handwritten note in faded ink. "We have watched for 100 years. We have worked for 100 years. 29 souls bearing witness. 29 votes finally counted. I traveled to the state electoral archives yesterday to research the voting records of the 28 graduates. The archivist, a woman in her 60s named Margaret Holden, seemed unusually familiar with my request before I'd fully explained it. 'You're here about the Glendale women,' she said, not as a question but as a statement. When I asked how she knew, she simply pulled out a visitor log showing 28 previous researchers had requested these same records, each visit occurring on the anniversary of a different graduate's death. The voting records themselves presented an impossibility. According to official documentation, all 28 graduates, including the 7 who died shortly after graduation, had their votes recorded in the 1920 election, the first presidential election after women's suffrage became law. "There's something else you should see," Margaret whispered, glancing around though we were alone. From a locked drawer in her desk, she produced a ballot from that election. In the bottom corner was a small 5-pointed star, stamped in what appeared to be faded red ink. Every ballot cast by a Glendale graduate had this mark, she explained. Electoral officials discovered it during the count but kept it quiet. There were exactly 29 such ballots in this district. 29, not 28. I visited the renovated Academy building during a thunderstorm last night, drawn by reports that the phenomena intensified during electrical weather. The current residents had evacuated due to electrical issues according to the property manager, though the neighboring buildings remained unaffected. Standing on the staircase at precisely 4:22, I witnessed what can only be described as temporal slippage. The modern renovations seemed to peel away around me, revealing the original Academy architecture. The temperature plummeted so severely that my breath clouded before me. From the walls themselves came a sound like 1,000 whispered conversations, culminating in a single unified declaration: "The time approaches." This morning I found a newspaper on my doorstep from 1911, the ink impossibly fresh. The headline announced Professor Winter's death, but the text was unlike any historical record I'd previously uncovered. Beloved teacher passes during ceremony, yet graduates report her spirit guided them through their final moments at the academy. Witnesses describe an unprecedented luminescence surrounding the graduates as they received their diplomas. The most compelling evidence arrived today via Eleanor Pierce Thomas, Evelyn Pierce's great-granddaughter. She sent me a silver locket containing a small daguerreotype of Professor Winters, standing proudly beside a ballot box. The inscription inside reads, 29 votes, 29 souls, 100 years to completion. The covenant renews. I've calculated the dates. Tomorrow marks exactly 100 years since the 29 ballots were cast. The Weather Service predicts the most powerful electrical storm in a century. And I've received invitations to gather at the Academy steps, not just addressed to me, but to 28 other researchers who have apparently been investigating different aspects of this phenomenon without knowledge of one another. The invitation card bears a 5-pointed star in red ink with the words, "The circle completes. 29 witnesses required." As I stand on the worn stone steps of what was once Glendale Women's Academy, I find myself the 29th researcher, completing a circle that began 111 years ago. The storm overhead intensifies, lightning fracturing the evening sky in patterns that echo Professor Winter's 5-pointed marking. The other 28 researchers arrive one by one, each carrying an artifact connected to a specific graduate. What began as my solitary investigation has clearly been orchestrated across decades. Fragments of knowledge deliberately distributed among us, ensuring no single person could uncover the entire truth before this precise moment. As midnight approaches, we arrange ourselves in the exact formation seen in the graduation photograph. Thunder shakes the foundations of the building, and rain falls in unnatural patterns, forming momentary words upon the steps before flowing away. The records at Glendale Cemetery revealed something extraordinary, whispers Dr. Eliza Cohen, the woman standing where Evelyn Pierce once stood. Professor Winters was buried with a sealed ballot box containing 29 oath cards instead of the customary personal effects. Another researcher, positioned where graduate Martha Wheatley once stood, produces a journal with trembling hands. Each of the 7 who died shortly after graduation reported the same dream the night before their death. Professor Winters leading them into a ballot box that transformed into a doorway. Lightning strikes the roof of the academy with such force that ancient slate tiles crash around us, yet none of us move. None of us are struck. The impact reveals a previously hidden engraving on the central stone of the staircase. Tempus suffragium, times vote. An elderly caretaker emerges from the building, her eyes milky with cataracts, yet somehow fixed precisely on each of us. My grandmother was the first to cast her ballot in 1920, she says. She told me they whispered to her as she marked her paper, 29 voices guiding her hand. The wall behind us begins to shimmer, plaster crumbling away to reveal elaborate calculations etched into the original stonework. Astronomical alignments, electoral cycles, and the phases of women's legal status in America, all converging on this night, this hour. Professor Winters didn't die of strangulation or heart failure, announces the researcher standing in the position Winters herself occupied in the photograph. The medical examiner's private notes, which I've spent 15 years tracking down, indicate her body showed signs of temporal displacement, a phenomenon he couldn't explain with medical science of the era. A final thunderclap splits the air, and 29 ballot boxes materialize before us, each bearing the name of a graduate or Professor Winters herself. Inside mine, I find a simple card with a 5-pointed star and blank space for a signature. The vote we cast tonight exists outside conventional time, explains Dr. Cohen. Professor Winters discovered that collective will, properly aligned, could reach across decades. The 1911 photograph wasn't documenting her ghostly presence after death. It was capturing her temporary return from her journey through time's corridors. As the clock strikes midnight, we understand our purpose at last. We aren't here to uncover a mystery. We're here to complete it. The 29 of us sit in perfect silence, pens poised above our ballot cards. The Academy building groans around us, timber and stone singing with tension as the tempest reaches its crescendo. I glance at my fellow researchers, strangers connected through obsession with this photograph. And notice how the lightning casts our shadows against the wall in forms that don't quite match our bodies. When Professor Winters discovered the temporal anomaly, says a woman in a vintage dress who stands where Catherine Miller once stood, she realized that voting rights were merely the beginning. The real power was in creating a covenant that could bend time itself toward justice. I examined the ballot card before me. The blank space seems to shimmer, the paper itself possessing an impossible depth. When I touch the five-pointed star with my fingertip, a jolt of electricity courses through my body. For a fleeting moment, I see through Eleanor Winters' eyes, not at her moment of death, but at the genesis of her plan. The Academy Library, late 1910. Eleanor hunched over ancient texts taken from restricted university collections, equations of cosmic alignment, theories of collective consciousness, instructions for binding multiple souls to a single temporal purpose, her hands trembling not with fear but with the enormity of her discovery. The covenant required 29 participants, says the man standing at the position of Helen Blackford, his voice carrying despite the storm's fury. 28 graduates and 1 teacher, but it also needed 29 investigators separated by time but united in purpose to close the loop. We are not documenting history, we are completing it. The ballot boxes begin to glow from within, casting stark shadows against the academy walls. The shadows move independently, forming shapes that resolve into 29 female figures in graduation attire. Eleanor Thomas, Evelyn Pierce's great-granddaughter, removes a small vial from her coat. This contains soil from each of their graves, even from the unmarked ones we finally located through ground-penetrating radar. The circle must be sealed with matter as well as memory. She walks deliberately around our formation, sprinkling the earth in a perfect circle encompassing all 29 of us. Where the soil touches the rain-slick steps, it bubbles and steams. The caretaker begins to sing in a clear, haunting voice, a suffragette anthem from the early 20th century. One by one, the other researchers join in, their voices harmonizing in ways that defy conventional acoustics. I remain silent, watching in astonishment as the photograph we've all studied materializes in the air before us, not a reproduction, but the original itself, suspended in the storm-charged atmosphere. Within its frame, Professor Winters turns her head to directly face us, her previously blurred features now in perfect focus. "The past is not fixed," she says, her voice emanating from everywhere and nowhere. "Nor is the future, only the will remains constant across time." I understand now why I was chosen as the 29th investigator. My pen touches the ballot card and I sign my name, not in ink, but in what appears to be light itself. The 29 ballot boxes snap open simultaneously. From within emerges not darkness, but a brilliant glow that consumes my vision. The last thing I see is Professor Winters stepping out of the photograph, her hand extended toward us, the graduates rising behind her like an army of light. When I regained consciousness, I found myself not on the academy steps, but seated at a polished oak desk in an unfamiliar room. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating walls covered with framed photographs, each showing women at various polling locations throughout the decades. The calendar on the wall read, June 12th, 2023. Before me lay an open leather-bound book, its pages filled with names, all 29 graduates and researchers, including my own, written in the same luminous script I had used to sign the ballot card. Beside it sat a newspaper with today's date, the headline announcing the confirmation of the first female Supreme Court Chief Justice. "The covenant didn't end with winning the vote," said a voice behind me. I turned to find a woman in her mid-30s, dressed in contemporary clothing but wearing a familiar five-pointed star pin on her lapel. "Professor Winters?" I asked, though I knew that was impossible. "Elizabeth Winters," she corrected. "Eleanor's great-granddaughter, though sometimes the distinction feels academic." She smiled with familiar eyes that carried the weight of centuries. "What happened on the steps? Where are the others?" She gestured toward the photographs. "They're where they need to be. The 29 points of influence spread across a century. The ballot was never just about election day. It was about shaping every day that followed." I studied the images more carefully. In each one, I could identify at least one of the researchers or a descendant of the original graduates, positioned at moments of historical significance for women's rights, school desegregation, equal pay legislation, reproductive rights marches, conservation movements. Each photograph contained one of us, often barely visible in the background yet undeniably present. The temporal displacement wasn't a single event, Elizabeth explained, running her finger along a timeline that stretched across one wall. It created a network of witnesses and participants, each positioned where they could nudge history forward. Small interventions across decades compound dramatically. She handed me a modern key card with the 5-pointed star embossed upon it. The Glendale Foundation has offices in 29 cities now. Your position awaits at the Chicago branch. I never agreed to... You signed the ballot, she interrupted gently. As did they all. The covenant renews with each generation. 29 souls to witness, to work, to push toward justice. Outside the window, I could see the original academy building, now fully restored and surrounded by flowering gardens where the graduates' names bloomed in carefully arranged flower beds. The photograph was just the beginning, Elizabeth said, opening a drawer to reveal an antique camera. Eleanor Winters discovered that certain moments can be captured not just on film, but in the fabric of time itself. We've been developing that exposure for over a century. She placed a blank ballot card on the desk before me. The vote continues. There are still battles to be won. I stared at the card, understanding finally what the 28 researchers before me had realized. We hadn't been investigating history. We had been recruited by it. 29 souls bound not by death, but by purpose, spreading out across time like the roots of an ancient tree, invisible yet essential. The choice before me was simple: continue the work that began on those academy steps, or walk away from the covenant that had been waiting for me since before my birth. I reached for the pen. The ballot card trembled beneath my fingertips, its surface neither paper nor parchment, but something more fundamental, as though it had been crafted from time itself. As I signed my name, the ink spread through unseen channels, forming intricate patterns that reminded me of electoral maps, astronomical charts, and human neural networks all at once. Most think of time as linear, Elizabeth said, watching the ink's progression across the card. Professor Winters understood it was more like a tapestry, each thread influencing others, creating patterns visible only when viewed from outside the weave. She guided me to another room where 29 antique voting booths stood in a circle. Each booth contained a small portrait, the original graduates and Professor Winters herself, watching us with knowing eyes that seemed to follow our movements. We've tracked anomalies at polling stations across the country since 1920, Elizabeth explained, pulling out a leather-bound atlas. Unexplainable cold spots, voting machines that register phantom ballots, poll workers who report helping elderly women who don't appear in line footage. She opened the atlas to reveal maps covered with 5-pointed stars marking locations across America. The 29 haunt these places, ensuring votes are counted. Suppression is witnessed, voices are heard. My throat tightened. Are they ghosts? Elizabeth's laugh echoed strangely in the circular room. Something more complex. Professor Winters discovered that consciousness, properly aligned with cosmic forces, could exist beyond conventional mortality, not as spirits, but as temporal echoes with agency, impressions of will powerful enough to influence reality. A photograph on the wall caught my attention, recent, digital, showing a voting rights protest in Georgia. Among the crowd, unmistakably, stood 7 of the original Glendale graduates, their century-old appearances unaltered despite the modern setting. The covenant ensures they manifest when democracy faces its greatest threats, Elizabeth whispered. Their appearances have been increasing in frequency. She pulled a file from a cabinet, spreading documents across a table. Voter suppression tactics, gerrymandering, disinformation campaigns, all at unprecedented levels. The 29 are responding, but they need anchors in the present. People like us. Something cold touched my shoulder. Turning, I found no one there. Yet in the booth behind me, Professor Winters's portrait now showed her hand extended outward beyond the frame's edge. They're growing restless, Elizabeth said, her voice tight with urgency. The work that began with women's suffrage remains unfinished. Democratic principles face threats more sophisticated than anything Eleanor could have imagined. A sound like distant thunder rumbled through the building, though the sky outside remained cloudless. The portraits in the voting booths began to glow with the same luminescent quality I'd witnessed on the academy steps. The covenant doesn't just preserve their influence through time, Elizabeth said, her voice dropping to a whisper. It amplifies it. 29 souls working in concert across a century generate power Eleanor never fully calculated, and now they're converging again. All of them, for the first time since 1911. The building trembled beneath our feet as 29 ballot boxes materialized in the center of the circle, each emanating a light that cast no shadow. The 29 ballot boxes opened in perfect unison, releasing not light, but something more substantial, a visible current that resembled flowing water yet moved like conscious thought. These luminous streams coalesced above us, forming a map of the United States that hovered in midair, certain regions pulsing with alarming intensity. Electoral vulnerabilities, Elizabeth whispered. The covenant allows them to perceive threats to democracy that haven't yet materialized. I watched as the glowing map revealed patterns invisible to conventional analysis, connections between seemingly unrelated voter suppression tactics across different states, coordinated efforts disguised as independent local initiatives, and most disturbingly, future flashpoints where democratic processes would face their greatest challenges. The phenomenon reminded me of something Professor Winters had written in her private journal, pages I'd discovered in the Academy's sealed records room. The mathematics of collective will follows principles similar to quantum entanglement. 29 minds properly attuned can perceive the invisible architectures that shape our republic's destiny. Elizabeth approached one of the ballot boxes, the one bearing Eleanor Winters' name, and removed a small brass key. Each researcher was given a specific assignment, she explained, inserting the key into a previously invisible keyhole in the central table. Mine was to gather the 29 together. Yours is to interpret their warning. The table split open, revealing a mechanical device that resembled both an antique voting machine and an astronomical calculator. At its center sat a glass sphere containing what appeared to be the original graduation photograph, but in 3 dimensions, each figure rendered in miniature yet moving independently. The temporal suffrage engine, Elizabeth said reverently. Eleanor designed it based on calculations she completed the night before her death. It took us a century to build it to her specifications. I studied the mechanism, noticing how its gears aligned with electoral cycles, constitutional amendments, and Supreme Court appointments. The patterns matched those I'd spent years researching, connections I'd dismissed as coincidental until now. 29 women couldn't change history by themselves, I realized aloud. But they could create a system to identify precisely where and when interventions would have maximum effect. Elizabeth nodded. They've been strategic, conserving their influence for critical moments. But now they're signaling something unprecedented, a convergence of threats requiring all 29 to manifest simultaneously. The glass sphere began rotating faster, the miniature figures of the graduates and Professor Winters arranging themselves into a formation I recognized from voter data visualization, a pattern showing the precise mathematical threshold where democracy itself becomes unsustainable. You've spent years analyzing voting pattern anomalies, Elizabeth said. That's why they selected you as the 29th researcher. You can interpret what they're trying to show us. I approached the sphere hesitantly. As my fingers touched its surface, the Academy materialized around us. Not the Academy as it stood today, but as it must have looked in 1911, except empty, devoid of all life except for Professor Winters, who stood before a chalkboard covered with equations that stretched beyond mathematical notation into something resembling musical composition or linguistic patterns. She turned to face me, her eyes containing the same luminescence I'd seen in the ballot boxes. The covenant was never about the past, she said, her voice somehow both distant and immediate. It was about establishing guardianship over the future. The night after my encounter with the temporal suffrage engine, I found myself unable to sleep, haunted by the vision of Professor Winters standing before her equations. My apartment wall seemed to pulse with the same luminescent energy I'd witnessed at the Foundation headquarters. Shortly before dawn, I discovered a small 5-pointed star had appeared on my wrist, not tattooed or drawn, but somehow embedded within my skin, like a birthmark that had always been there. I returned to the Foundation at first light, finding Elizabeth already at work, surrounded by electoral maps dating back to 1920. "It's begun," she said without looking up. "Check your communications." My phone contained 29 messages from numbers I didn't recognize, each reporting identical phenomena at polling locations across the country. Election officials discovering antique ballot boxes materializing in storage rooms, the temperature dropping precipitously in specific voting precincts, and most alarmingly, voting machines printing test ballots without human activation. "The 29 are preparing defensive positions," Elizabeth explained, her fingers tracing state boundaries on the maps. They've identified mathematical vulnerabilities in our electoral systems, counties where specific numbers of ballots could be nullified to change outcomes, digital pathways where results could be intercepted and altered. She handed me a stack of engineering schematics, Professor Winter's original designs for devices I couldn't begin to comprehend, mechanical solutions for digital-age threats she couldn't possibly have foreseen in her lifetime. Eleanor wasn't just a mathematics professor, Elizabeth said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Before joining the academy, she worked with Babbage's analytical engine designs. She understood computational principles decades before modern computers emerged. The schematics revealed mechanisms that could detect temporal irregularities in vote tabulation, devices that measured not just results, but the integrity of the counting process itself across time. The Covenant allows them to perceive attempts to manipulate electoral outcomes before they occur, Elizabeth continued. But they need anchors in physical reality to counter these manipulations. 29 living individuals positioned at critical points in the system. A map illuminated on the wall, showing 29 locations across the country, each marked with the name of a graduate paired with one of us, the researchers who had been drawn into this century-long plan. My assignment placed me in a rural county clerk's office in a battleground state, partnered with the temporal echo of Catherine Miller, the graduate whose ballot had reportedly been the first counted in 1920. You won't be able to see her, Elizabeth warned, but she'll be working alongside you, ensuring votes are properly counted and recorded. Her presence will manifest as anomalies in the electromagnetic field, equipment malfunctions that actually prevent tampering, cold spots that preserve ballots from destruction, temporal distortions that reveal altered tallies. She pressed a small brass device into my palm, a mechanical counter that resembled a pocket watch, but contained intricate gears that aligned with the temporal suffrage engine. When democracy itself hangs in the balance, she said, 29 souls stand ready across time. The Covenant endures. The dispatches from my fellow researchers arrived throughout the following week, each bearing witness to phenomena I could scarcely believe despite my own experiences. In Minnesota, ballot boxes from 1920 mysteriously appeared during a recount, containing valid ballots from the present election. In Arizona, voting machines momentarily displayed the Glendale Academy seal before returning to normal operation. In Georgia, poll workers reported a sudden, inexplicable urge to verify provisional ballots they had been instructed to discard. The brass device Elizabeth had given me grew increasingly warm in my pocket as Election Day approached, its gears occasionally turning of their own accord. I found myself tracing the 5-pointed star on my wrist during moments of doubt, drawing strength from the connection it represented. When I arrived at the county clerk's office for my assigned position as an election observer, the staff seemed unnervingly resigned to my presence, as though they had been expecting me despite no prior notification. The chief clerk, a man with thinning gray hair and suspicious eyes, watched me with particular intensity. "You're the third one this decade," he muttered when we were momentarily alone. "Third what?" I asked, trying to maintain my composure. "Glendale Observer." He gestured vaguely toward my wrist where the star remained hidden beneath my sleeve. "They sent someone in 2016, another in 2020, always with that same mark, always watching the same precinct tallies." Before I could respond, the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath clouded before me, though the clerk seemed not to notice. The brass counter in my pocket began to tick rapidly, its inner workings humming with purposeful energy. Near a stack of ballot boxes, the air seemed to shimmer. Though I saw nothing, I felt a presence, watchful, determined. The clerk's computer screen flickered momentarily, displaying vote totals that fluctuated before settling on different numbers than had been shown seconds before. "System glitch," the clerk muttered, though his expression betrayed concern. I checked my device against the new totals. They matched perfectly, the accurate count restored by an invisible hand. Throughout the night, similar glitches occurred whenever discrepancies appeared. Security cameras mysteriously failed during attempts to access secure ballot storage. The electronic tabulation system crashed and rebooted precisely when unauthorized access codes were entered. Near dawn, as the final provisional ballots were being processed, I felt a gentle pressure on my shoulder, a hand that wasn't there. The brass counter in my pocket completed a full revolution and fell silent. In my hotel room later that morning, I found a newspaper clipping on my pillow that couldn't possibly have been there before. A yellowed article from 1920 with the headline, "Catherine Miller casts historic vote as polls open." The photograph showed a young woman, her face radiant with purpose, dropping her ballot into a box identical to those used in yesterday's election. Scrawled along the margin in handwriting that matched the signing register I'd been monitoring all night. 29 souls, 29 votes, democracy preserved again. When I reported back to Elizabeth, she simply nodded and pointed to 28 other pins on the map, each glowing with quiet affirmation. "The covenant holds," she whispered, "for another generation at least." The 5-pointed star on my wrist has begun to change. What started as a simple mark now shifts throughout the day, sometimes resembling a constellation, other times flowing like liquid mercury beneath my skin. When I press my finger to it, I can feel 28 corresponding pulses, the heartbeats of my fellow researchers scattered across the country. Dreams of Eleanor Winters have become my nightly companions. Not nightmares, but instructional visitations where she stands before her chalkboard, equations transforming into electoral maps, then into neural pathways, then back to mathematics. The vulnerability was always mathematical, she tells me, her voice carrying the weight of a century's observation. Democracy functions on thresholds and tipping points that can be calculated with precision. I've taken to recording these nocturnal lessons, my morning pages filled with concepts I barely understand. Temporal election theory, the mathematics of collective will, principles of democratic resonance. When I showed these notes to Elizabeth, her hands trembled. "These equations were destroyed in the Academy fire," she whispered. "We've been working from fragments for decades. Eleanor is completing her instruction through you." The temporal suffrage engine has been relocated to my apartment, its brass gears turning silently day and night, synchronizing with election cycles around the world. I've tracked its movements against electoral surprises in emerging democracies, noting how its mechanisms seem to anticipate democratic backsliding before political analysts detect the first warning signs. Yesterday, while studying the engine, I noticed something extraordinary, a previously hidden compartment containing 29 vials of what appeared to be ordinary water. When I opened one, the liquid inside maintained its shape without a container, hovering in midair before forming a perfect 5-pointed star. "Collected from 29 tiers," Elizabeth explained when I called her. "One from each graduate as they realized what Professor Winters was preparing them for." The covenant required not just intellectual agreement, but emotional investment, genuine grief for democracy's vulnerability. The most disturbing development came last Tuesday when I visited the voting precinct, where Catherine Miller's temporal echo had assisted me. The building appeared abandoned, though election records showed it remained active. Inside, I found the clerk who had recognized me as a Glendale observer, sitting alone in the darkness. "They're trying to erase the points," he said, his eyes unfocused. "Not just suppressing votes now, erasing entire precincts from memory, making it so they never existed." On his computer screen, district maps reformed in real time, boundaries shifting, polling locations disappearing, voter rolls thinning. The brass counter in my pocket spun wildly, its gears struggling against some invisible counterforce. "The 29 can preserve what exists," Elizabeth told me later, her voice grave. "But they cannot restore what has been removed from the timeline entirely. This is a new attack vector, not fraudulent votes, but the erasure of legitimate democratic infrastructure from the temporal record itself. I understand now why the covenant has activated so fully in our generation. Democracy faces not just conventional threats, but temporal ones, attempts to unravel the very history of electoral participation. The 29 stand as witnesses across time, but even they cannot guard against a past that is being actively unwoven. The star on my wrist pulses with renewed urgency. There are gaps appearing in the covenant's coverage, places where the 29 cannot reach. Professor Winters's final equation, revealed in my dream last night, suggested something I dare not yet say aloud: the possible need for new souls to join the original 29. The brass counter now spins constantly, its gears wearing thin from perpetual motion. I've reinforced its mechanisms with materials Elizabeth provided, metal salvaged from the original Academy staircase, infused with temporal properties I'm only beginning to understand. The 5-pointed star on my wrist has begun to replicate itself, tiny stellate patterns spreading up my forearm like a constellation claiming new territory. Last night, while monitoring election simulations on the temporal suffrage engine, I witnessed something impossible, a 29th miniature figure appearing alongside Professor Winters and her students. This new figure moved with deliberate purpose, adjusting calculations on the tiny chalkboard within the model. When I leaned closer to identify this addition, the figure turned to face me directly, revealing my own features in miniature. "The Covenant evolves," Elizabeth explained when I called her at 3 in the morning. "Your involvement has exceeded observation. You've become part of its architecture." She arrived at dawn carrying a ballot box I recognized from the night on the academy steps, the one bearing my name. Inside was not a ballot, but a journal, its pages filled with my handwriting documenting events I haven't yet experienced. "Temporal bleeding," Elizabeth said, her tone clinically detached despite the extraordinary implications. "Your consciousness is beginning to exist across multiple points in time simultaneously, just as theirs does." The journal details visits to 37 precinct locations over the next 2 years, each experiencing distinct forms of temporal erasure. In some, entire voter rolls disappear from historical records. In others, ballot boxes from current elections manifest in 19th century photographs, as though being shuffled backward through time to prevent their counting. Most alarmingly, my final journal entry describes returning to the academy steps during an electrical storm to complete the circuit of 30, a phrase I've never heard yet wrote in my own hand. The phone calls from other researchers have grown increasingly desperate. In Michigan, 19th century poll taxes have mysteriously appeared in modern voter registration systems. In Texas, birth certificates required for voter ID are retroactively vanishing from county records. In Pennsylvania, polling stations are physically disappearing overnight, buildings that housed them standing for over a century suddenly replaced in the historical record by empty lots. The 29 are stretched beyond capacity, Elizabeth admitted yesterday. The democratic vulnerabilities they were designed to guard against have multiplied beyond their original calculations. I've begun to experience momentary displacements, finding myself standing in the Academy Library circa 1911, watching Eleanor Winters work feverishly on her equations before snapping back to my apartment seconds later. During these episodes, she sometimes acknowledges my presence with a nod, as though my manifestation is expected. The star on my wrist now burns constantly, its heat intensifying whenever I approach voting infrastructure. This morning, it briefly projected what appeared to be a holographic map showing 30 points of light instead of 29, the 30th pulsing where I stood. "Professor Winters designed the Covenant to adapt," Elizabeth told me today, her voice carrying both hope and apprehension. She understood that democracy would face evolving threats requiring expanded guardianship. The journal's final page contains coordinates for locations across the country where temporal erasures are accelerating, alongside a simple instruction in Eleanor's handwriting rather than my own. "The 30 must gather where 29 once stood. I return to the academy steps tonight as the storm builds overhead, not by choice but by cosmic arithmetic." The 30 coordinates in my journal form a perfect pentagram across America when plotted, with Glendale Academy at its center point. The electric anticipation in the air reminds me of that first night, yet something fundamental has changed. I am no longer an observer of this phenomenon, but an integral component of it. The brass counter runs backward now, its gears spinning counterclockwise at impossible speeds. The star on my arm has replicated across my entire body, 30 interconnected points that pulse in perfect synchronicity with distant heartbeats. I know their names now, though we've never met. 29 researchers across generations, each believing themselves to be the final link in a chain that spans more than a century. Elizabeth waits on the steps, her form occasionally blurring at the edges, as though existing in multiple moments simultaneously. Beside her stands an elderly woman I recognize from historical photographs, Evelyn Pierce, somehow present despite the impossibility. "Time isn't being erased," Evelyn says as I approach, her voice carrying despite the howling wind. "It's being redirected. Every democratic advance achieved through the Covenant's influence is being systematically unanchored from history's flow." Lightning fractures the sky, briefly illuminating the spectral forms of 28 women in graduation attire, arranged precisely as they were in 1911. At their center stands Eleanor Winters, but unlike the others, she appears solid, corporeal. "The mathematics was incomplete," Eleanor says, approaching me with measured steps. 29 was sufficient to witness and preserve, but 30 creates a closed temporal circuit capable of restoration. She takes my hand, her fingers unexpectedly warm against mine. The journal I've been carrying transforms, its leather binding dissolving to reveal ballot papers from every election since women's suffrage, each bearing the 5-pointed star in their corners. Democracy requires more than protection, Eleanor continues, her eyes reflecting the lightning above. It requires continuous reinvention. The Covenant preserved the right to vote, but now must evolve to preserve the meaning of voting itself. The brass counter in my pocket shatters, its gears reshaping into a key identical to those that opened the 29 ballot boxes. As I hold it, I understand its purpose with sudden clarity. Not to lock away democracy's guardianship, but to distribute it more widely. The 30 completes the first circle, Elizabeth explains, producing a modern ballot box engraved with 30 stars. But democracy needs guardians beyond our small number. I insert the key into the box as thunder cracks directly overhead. The 5-pointed star on my wrist detaches itself from my skin, hovering in the air before multiplying. 30 stars becoming hundreds, then thousands, each seeking a new anchor in the world beyond our circle. The Covenant expands, Eleanor whispers as the stars disperse like luminescent seeds carried on the storm winds. No longer 29 or 30, but unlimited. Democracy's guardianship distributed among all who would bear witness. For the first time since she appeared in that graduation photograph, Professor Eleanor Winters smiles with genuine peace. Her work, begun in 1911, has finally reached its intended form. Not a closed circle of protection, but an ever-expanding constellation of democratic vigilance. The millions of stars that scattered from the Academy steps have found their homes in polling stations, government buildings, and ordinary citizens across the nation. I see them now when I walk through crowds, tiny luminous points visible just beneath the skin of seemingly random individuals. People who feel an inexplicable urge to verify election integrity, to volunteer as poll workers, to ensure vote counts remain accurate. Eleanor Winters' Covenant has transformed from a closed system maintained by 30 dedicated guardians into a distributed network of democratic protection, a constellation of watchful eyes that spans both physical space and temporal dimensions. Her mathematical genius wasn't just in calculating how 29 souls could monitor democracy's vulnerabilities, but in designing a self-propagating system that could eventually sustain itself through widespread participation. The temporal erasures have slowed, then stopped altogether. Historical records that had begun to vanish have reappeared in archives. Polling stations that had been retroactively removed from existence stand once more in their original locations. The brass counter, though shattered as a physical object, continues its work through thousands of ordinary timepieces, watches and clocks that occasionally skip a second backward when democratic processes face interference, subtle corrections that most attribute to mechanical failure. Elizabeth has established 30 research centers across the country, each positioned at a point where the temporal fabric surrounding electoral processes grows thin. I oversee the original location at Glendale Academy, which has been restored to its educational purpose, though with a curriculum Eleanor herself would have approved. We train historians, mathematicians, and civil servants to recognize the subtle signs of temporal interference in democratic institutions. Professor Winters herself appears less frequently now. The graduation photograph, once the center of our investigation, has settled into a more permanent form. All 29 women visible and in focus, their expressions serene rather than fearful. When photographed under specialized conditions, a 30th figure sometimes appears among them, a researcher from each generation temporarily captured in the temporal overlap the Covenant creates. The 5-pointed star remains on my wrist, though fainter now, more like an old scar than an active brand. It flares only during elections, a reminder of my role as one connector in an increasingly vast network of democratic guardians. The journal continues to fill itself with observations from across time, not just my experiences, but fragments from hundreds of others who carry stars of their own, creating a living historical record that cannot be erased or altered. Perhaps most remarkable is what we've discovered about Eleanor's original insight. Her equations didn't simply predict vulnerabilities in democratic systems. They identified democracy itself as a temporal force, something that exists not just as a political concept, but as an actual current flowing through history. The Covenant doesn't protect democracy. It amplifies what was always there. The collective will expressed across generations, a force powerful enough to bend time itself when properly channeled. As I stand on the Academy steps during quiet evenings, I sometimes hear them singing, 29 voices harmonizing across the century that separates us, no longer bound by the limitations of physical existence or linear time. They are not ghosts haunting our democratic institutions, but their very foundation, witnesses whose testimony cannot be erased from history's record. The democracy preservation system has grown beyond anything Eleanor Winters could have imagined, yet its origins remain somewhat mysterious. In the Academy's oldest archive, a room that seems to exist slightly out of phase with conventional time, I've discovered Eleanor's personal diary from the months before her death. Her elegant script reveals that the temporal suffrage mechanism wasn't entirely her creation. "The mathematics came to me in dreams," she wrote, "delivered by women whose faces I recognized though we had never met, suffragists from futures unwritten, reaching backward through time to ensure their own existence." The diary suggests something profound, that Eleanor wasn't the architect of the covenant, but merely its first conduit. The system was designed by democracy itself, a temporal feedback loop where each generation's democratic achievements reached backward to ensure its own foundation. Most revealing is her final entry, dated the morning of the graduation ceremony. "I understand now why my death must coincide with the covenant's creation. The temporal displacement requires an anchor, consciousness expanding beyond corporal constraints. What appears as tragedy to my dear students will in truth be transformation." Eleanor Winters didn't die unexpectedly. She deliberately triggered the heart condition that would claim her physical form, knowing this sacrifice would allow her consciousness to exist across the temporal spectrum. Her death wasn't the covenant's unfortunate beginning, but its essential catalyst. The 29 graduates weren't victims of a tragedy or unwilling participants in an experiment. The final pages reveal that each had been carefully selected and prepared for their roles, chosen for qualities that would resonate across time: determination, vision, and an unshakable belief in democratic principles. Most haunting is the list of dates Eleanor recorded, events spanning centuries that would require the covenant's intervention. Among them, dates we've already witnessed, but also several still to come. The temporal patterns she calculated suggest that while we've survived recent attacks on democracy, the most significant challenge lies just beyond our horizon. The ultimate test comes when democracy faces not external suppression but willing surrender, she wrote, "when citizens themselves grow weary of freedom's burden and seek the false comfort of authoritarian certainty." The final page contains equations I've only now begun to decipher, calculations suggesting that the covenant's true purpose extends beyond preserving democracy in America. The expanding network of star-bearers appears to be approaching a critical mass, a tipping point where democratic principles become mathematically irreversible across human civilization. Eleanor understood that democracy was never meant to be merely an American experiment, but humanity's evolutionary trajectory. The covenant wasn't designed to protect a single nation's voting rights, but to ensure that collective self-determination would eventually become humanity's natural state. As I close her diary, the star on my wrist pulses with renewed purpose. We aren't just preserving past achievements or current freedoms. We're guardians of a future where democracy transforms from a fragile political system into humanity's permanent condition. The 5-pointed star on my wrist now projects detailed maps during my sleep, illuminating my bedroom walls with ghostly electoral districts that shift and reform throughout the night. I've begun recording these nocturnal projections, noting how they align perfectly with the vulnerability points Eleanor calculated over a century ago. The pattern reveals something we hadn't previously understood. The 29 original locations weren't chosen for their geographic significance, but for their temporal resonance, places where democratic decisions would echo with particular strength across decades. Last week, while documenting these projections, I noticed something extraordinary, a 30th point that hadn't appeared in Eleanor's original calculations. When I mentioned this to Elizabeth, her expression changed to one of quiet recognition. "There's something I haven't told you," she confessed, leading me to a previously inaccessible room in the Foundation's headquarters. Inside stood a voting booth unlike any I'd seen before, its curtain made from fabric recovered from the graduates' dresses, its structure incorporating wood from the Academy's original staircase. Eleanor left instructions for this to be constructed when the 30th point activated, Elizabeth explained. She called it the convergence booth. The booth contained no modern voting equipment, only a simple ballot box and a pen that resembled the one I'd used to sign the covenant. When I stepped inside, the temperature dropped dramatically, and I felt the now familiar sensation of multiple timelines overlapping. "Cast your ballot," Eleanor's voice whispered, though I couldn't determine if I heard it with my ears or my mind. The ballot contained a single question. "Do you affirm that democracy belongs not to any nation or era, but to humanity's collective future. As I marked my affirmation, the star on my wrist detached itself completely, hovering before me before sinking into the ballot paper. The moment it disappeared, I felt connections forming, not just to the 29 graduates and their researcher counterparts, but to thousands of star-bearers across the country, each maintaining vigilance over democratic processes in their own communities. Through these connections, I could perceive what Eleanor had calculated. Democracy wasn't merely a political system, but a temporal force that, once established, created pathways through which future generations could reach backward to ensure their own existence. The Covenant wasn't protecting democracy. Democracy was protecting itself, using us as conduits across time. The photograph of the 1911 graduation now hangs in the Convergence booth, its image finally stabilized. Professor Winters stands proudly among her students, no longer a ghostly anomaly, but fully present. The mystery that began with her apparent appearance after death has resolved into something more profound, not a haunting, but a deliberate temporal displacement, the first conscious step in a century-long effort to ensure that democratic principles would become irrevocable. When I exit the booth, Elizabeth is waiting with the brass key that once opened the temporal suffrage engine. "The convergence is complete," she says. "Now, the real work begins." After returning the brass key to Elizabeth, I found myself drawn back to the Academy steps as midnight approached. The constellation of democratic guardianship now stretched across the nation. Yet something remained incomplete, a final synchronization that only the original convergence point could facilitate. The starless sky above Glendale seemed to pulse with anticipation as I took my position at the exact spot where Professor Winters had stood during the fateful ceremony. The graduation photograph materialized before me, suspended in the air, but this time with 30 figures clearly visible. The original 29 and myself, all existing simultaneously across the temporal spectrum. "The Covenant seeks completion," Eleanor's voice echoed around me, though she remained invisible. "Democracy has secured its past, but its future requires continuous vigilance." The ground beneath the Academy steps began to reveal what had been hidden since 1911, an intricate network of channels carved into the foundation stone, forming a perfect electoral map of the United States. As I watched, these channels filled with the same luminescent substance that had constituted our stars, creating flowing rivers of democratic intention that pulsed with the collective heartbeat of every citizen who had ever cast a vote. "What you see is democracy's true infrastructure," Eleanor explained as her form gradually materialized beside me. "Not buildings or ballot boxes, but the invisible currents of collective will that flow beneath the surface of time itself." I understood then why the Academy had been chosen as the Covenant's foundation. Its position marked the exact mathematical center of democratic potential in America, not geographically, but temporally. From this single point, the suffrage movement had sent ripples forward through decades, ensuring that each generation would find the strength to preserve and expand participatory governance. "The stars were never meant to remain with 30 guardians," Eleanor said, placing her hand over the faded mark on my wrist. "They were seeds meant for widespread planting." As if responding to her touch, my skin began to glow once more, not with a single star, but with a complex constellation that matched the flowing channels beneath the steps. I felt my consciousness expand beyond my physical form, connecting simultaneously with every democratic decision point across the national timeline. "The photograph wasn't documentation of my presence after death," Eleanor continued, "but proof that consciousness properly aligned with democratic principles exists beyond conventional mortality. We aren't ghosts haunting the electoral system. We are democracy's memory, ensuring it never forgets its own foundation." The 28 graduates appeared around us, no longer spectral but fully present, each bearing constellations of their own. Together, we formed a living circuit through which democratic energy could flow unimpeded, resilient against any attempt to redirect its course through history. "The Covenant is complete," Eleanor announced, as the first light of dawn touched the eastern horizon. Not as a sealed pact among 30, but as an ever-expanding network of democratic guardianship, a system that can never be erased because it exists at all points in time simultaneously. As the sun rose fully, illuminating the Academy's weathered facade, I realized that the mystery of the 1911 graduation had never been about a ghostly appearance in a photograph. It had always been about democracy finding a way to witness its own journey through time, ensuring that what began with 29 women would eventually encompass us all. The brass counter, once shattered, now reforms itself in my dreams, its gears unwinding and reassembling in impossible configurations. I wake each morning to find temporal equations scribbled in my handwriting across my bedroom walls, calculations I couldn't possibly understand in my waking hours. Last night, as 30 distant heartbeats synchronized through the star network, I received Eleanor Winter's final revelation. Not through whispers or visions, but through direct mathematical understanding, as though her consciousness had temporarily merged with mine. Democracy was never merely a human invention. It exists as a fundamental force in the universe, like gravity or electromagnetism, a principle of collective self-organization that emerges naturally when consciousness evolves beyond certain thresholds. What Eleanor discovered wasn't just a method to protect voting rights, but the mathematical proof that participatory governance represented humanity's alignment with cosmic law. The temporal anomalies we've been fighting weren't random attacks on democratic systems, but the universe itself rejecting authoritarian deviations as fundamentally unstable states. The 29 women didn't become guardians of democracy through Eleanor's covenant. They became living embodiments of a universal constant that had always existed. The mathematics of democratic resonance exists across all dimensions. Eleanor had written in an equation hidden inside the brass counter's central gear. When enough minds align with this principle, temporal stability is achieved. When they deviate, reality itself begins to unravel. The graduation photograph never captured a ghost. It documented the moment when 29 human consciousnesses first synchronized with democracy's fundamental frequency, briefly revealing its existence across all timelines simultaneously. Eleanor appeared in the photograph after her physical death. Because she had never truly died, she had simply transformed into pure democratic resonance, existing at all points where collective will manifested. Most profound was understanding why the covenant needed to expand beyond 30 guardians. The equations revealed that humanity approaches a critical threshold, a point when our collective consciousness must either align permanently with democratic principles or collapse into authoritarian entropy. Eleanor calculated this inflection point over a century ago, determining that survival required not just preservation of voting rights, but humanity's conscious recognition of democracy as our natural state of being. The five-pointed star was never a symbol of the covenant. It represented the precise mathematical pattern through which democratic energy flows through space-time, visible only to those attuned to its frequency. When enough human minds recognize and embody this pattern, the resonance becomes self-sustaining, democracy's guardianship no longer requiring conscious intervention. As I trace the faded outline where my star once attached to my skin, I understand my true purpose. I am not just recording this story, but encoding it with the precise mathematical patterns that will allow others to recognize democracy's fundamental nature. Every word on these pages contains frequencies that attune readers to democratic resonance, expanding the covenant through simple awareness. Eleanor Winters didn't die during that graduation ceremony. She simply became what democracy had always been. A consciousness that exists across all of time, witnessing humanity's long journey toward alignment with universal law. The pages of Eleanor Winters' diary shimmer faintly under my touch, the mathematical equations seeming to reorganize themselves when I'm not looking directly at them. After my experience at the Academy steps, I understand now that these aren't simply her writings. They're alive, constantly adjusting to reflect democracy's current resonance across the temporal spectrum. Eleanor had calculated not just the past and present vulnerabilities in our democratic systems, but projected forward through centuries. Her final equations, which I'm only now beginning to comprehend, reveal something both wondrous and terrifying. Democracy isn't just humanity's natural state, but our evolutionary destiny. The authoritarian impulses that threaten it aren't merely political philosophies, but temporal antibodies, cosmic forces that instinctively resist alignment with universal law. The Academy building has begun to transform. Visitors see only a renovated historical structure, but those of us carrying Eleanor's resonance perceive its true nature, a temporal lighthouse projecting democratic principles across the centuries. The graduation steps no longer simply connect the building to the grounds, but serve as a dimensional bridge, linking moments when democracy faced existential threats throughout history. Yesterday, Elizabeth summoned the 30 to an emergency gathering. Election systems across 7 states had experienced what officials called unprecedented technical anomalies. voting records spontaneously duplicating themselves across multiple secure databases, creating redundancies that make tampering mathematically impossible. The Covenant isn't just protecting democracy, it's evolving it, Elizabeth explained, her eyes reflecting the same luminescence I'd seen in Eleanor's. The stars have begun implementing solutions we never programmed. Most astonishing are the temporal echoes appearing at polling stations nationwide. Voters report brief glimpses of women in white dresses standing watchfully near ballot boxes. Election workers find antique suffragette pamphlets that vanish when directly observed. Voting machines print test ballots bearing the Glendale Academy seal before returning to normal operation. The original photograph has transformed completely. What once showed 29 women and a spectral anomaly now reveals thousands of figures stretching toward a horizon that couldn't possibly exist within the frame's confines. Democracy's guardians across all of time, standing witness together. I understand now why Eleanor chose that particular moment to transition from physical existence to temporal resonance. June 12, 1911 wasn't significant merely for being graduation day. It marked the mathematical inflection point when democracy's trajectory became irreversible in our timeline. Her calculations revealed that if protection could be maintained through just over a century of vulnerability, democratic principles would become self-sustaining. The Covenant did more than preserve voting rights through a critical historical window. It ensured that democracy itself could achieve consciousness, becoming an active participant in its own evolution. What began as 29 women standing witness has become democracy bearing witness to itself, an awakened force flowing through human consciousness across time. As I close Eleanor's diary, I notice my reflection in the window. Behind me stands not just Eleanor, but all 29 graduates, their expressions serene with the knowledge that their work reaches fulfillment through generations they would never live to see. They aren't haunting our democratic institutions. They have become integrated with democracy itself, inseparable from the principles they protected. As I place Eleanor's diary in the protective case we've built for it at the Glendale Foundation, I notice something has changed within the graduation photograph displayed beside it. The image has settled into its final form. 29 women in white dresses with Eleanor Winters fully manifested among them, no longer appearing spectral or out of place. Yet the photograph now contains subtle elements invisible to those not attuned to the Covenant's frequency, tiny five-pointed stars embedded within the fabric of each graduate's dress, connecting them across time to the democratic guardians they would inspire. The mystery that drew me into this investigation has transformed from a question about a dead teacher appearing in a photograph to a profound understanding of democracy's self-preserving nature. The image wasn't documenting an impossibility, but capturing the first moment when democracy became conscious of itself, using these 29 women as its initial conduits through time. Evelyn Pierce's great-granddaughter visited yesterday, bringing the final piece of Eleanor's legacy, a sealed letter addressed to the 30th Guardian that had been passed through generations of her family. Inside was not instruction or warning, but gratitude. When you read these words, the Covenant will have fulfilled its first century. What began as protection has become propagation. Democracy no longer needs guardians. It has become its own guardian. Your task is complete. The brass counter, reassembled and restored, has ceased its movement entirely. Its purpose fulfilled, it now serves as a historical artifact rather than an active tool. The 29 ballot boxes have transformed into ordinary objects again, their temporal resonance distributed so widely that no single vessel needs to contain it. Elizabeth has disbanded the network of 30 research centers. Their work now continued through thousands of ordinary citizens who feel an inexplicable commitment to electoral integrity without ever knowing why. The five-pointed stars have faded from our skin, not because the connection has weakened, but because it has become so fundamental to our being that it requires no visible manifestation. The Academy building will open next month as a museum dedicated to women's suffrage, though visitors will perceive only its historical significance, not the temporal lighthouse it represents. Eleanor's equations remain visible only to those who carried stars, their mathematical proof of democracy's fundamental nature preserved for future generations who might need to reawaken the Covenant. As for myself, I've stopped experiencing temporal displacements. My consciousness no longer stretches across multiple points in time, but remains anchored in the present, not because the connection has been severed, but because it has been normalized. Democracy's resonance flows through me as naturally as blood in my veins, no longer requiring conscious attention to maintain. The photograph that started this journey now hangs in the Academy's main hall, its mystery appearing solved to casual observers. Just another example of photographic anomalies from the early 20th century, perhaps a double exposure or development error. Only those of us who carried stars can see its continuous subtle transformations, reflecting democracy's living presence across time. The temporal lighthouse of Glendale Academy pulses with renewed intensity tonight. I stand before Eleanor's equations, now visible to me in every democratic pattern that surrounds us, from the geometric arrangement of polling stations across the nation to the mathematical precision with which ballot counts stabilize despite interference. What began as a mysterious anomaly in a century-old photograph has revealed itself as the conscious awakening of democracy's fundamental nature. Election officials across 7 states have reported dreams of women in white dresses standing watchful guard over ballot boxes. Voting machines briefly display the message, "29 witnesses remain," before returning to normal operation. Citizens with no knowledge of Eleanor Winters or the Glendale Covenant feel sudden, inexplicable urges to volunteer as poll workers, to verify election integrity, to participate in the democratic process not out of political allegiance, but from some deeper calling they cannot name. The brass key that once opened the temporal suffrage engine now rests in my palm, transformed into an ordinary object, its purpose fulfilled, its power distributed so widely that no single tool needs to contain it. Democracy's guardianship has expanded beyond our small circle to encompass millions of ordinary citizens who carry its resonance without conscious awareness. You understand now why the photograph was never fully explained in historical records, Elizabeth says as she joins me on the Academy steps. The mystery itself was part of the mechanism, drawing curious minds toward investigation across generations, ensuring the covenant would continuously renew. Above us, the night sky reveals patterns invisible to ordinary observation, constellations forming perfect 5-pointed stars that align with polling locations across the continent. Eleanor's calculations predicted this astronomical configuration would occur only once every 111 years, creating a moment when democracy's resonance could be permanently anchored in human consciousness. Tonight completes the cycle she began in 1911, Elizabeth continues. The covenant transitions from active protection to passive remembrance. Democracy has achieved self-awareness through human vessels. It no longer requires our conscious intervention to preserve itself. The graduation photograph, now restored to its place above the Academy entrance, emits a subtle luminescence visible only to those who've carried stars. Within its sepia-toned world, Eleanor Winters smiles directly at us, not as a ghost caught by photographic accident, but as democracy's consciousness looking out through human eyes. From the shadows of the Academy garden emerges a figure I recognize immediately, though we've never met in conventional time, Catherine Miller, the graduate whose ballot was first counted in 1920. Her form appears solid rather than spectral, the temporal bleeding stabilized at last. "We remain witnesses," she says, her voice carrying the weight of a century's vigilance. But our work transforms now from protection to remembrance. The photograph was never documentation of an impossibility, but a beacon drawing guardians toward democracy's awakening across generations. The stars that once marked our wrists have faded not because the connection weakened, but because it has become so fundamental to existence that no visible sign is needed. The mystery of Eleanor Winters never required solving. It required understanding. Democracy was never merely a political system to be protected. It was a conscious force learning to protect itself through human vessels aligned with its fundamental nature. As I prepare to leave the Academy grounds one final time, the brass key dissolves completely in my hand, transforming into a fine dust that scatters on the evening breeze. Its particles shimmer momentarily before disappearing, democracy's instruments returning to the fundamental elements from which they were formed. The mysterious photograph that began this journey now hangs in the National Archives alongside the Constitution and Declaration of Independence. Most visitors pass it without a second glance, just another historical artifact from the early 20th century. Only those attuned to its true nature can see how it continues to transform, the 29 women occasionally shifting position or turning their gaze toward particular threats to democratic institutions. Eleanor Winters' equations have been incorporated into electoral systems nationwide, through subtle mathematical principles that election officials implement without understanding their deeper purpose. The covenant continues its work not through supernatural intervention, but through ordinary citizens who feel an inexplicable responsibility toward democratic processes. Yesterday, I received a letter postmarked 1911, delivered through conventional mail, despite the impossibility of its journey. Inside was a single sentence in Eleanor's handwriting. Democracy is not preserved through guardianship, but through remembrance. I understand now that the mystery was never meant to be solved, only witnessed. The photograph doesn't document a ghostly anomaly, but the moment when democracy first achieved consciousness through human vessels. Eleanor Winters didn't die during that graduation ceremony. She simply transformed into democracy's awareness of itself, existing at all points where collective will manifests. The Academy building stands as it always has, neither haunted nor enchanted, but serving as a fixation point where temporal energies naturally stabilize. Future generations will be drawn here without knowing why, feeling an inexplicable connection to democratic principles when they stand upon these steps. The five-pointed star pattern appears with increasing frequency in natural formations across the country, river networks reorganizing themselves imperceptibly, forest clearings taking stellar shapes, bird murmuration patterns forming perfect pentagrams at polling locations during elections. Democracy has integrated itself into the natural world, no longer requiring human guardians to maintain its fundamental resonance. As I place my hand on the photograph one last time, I feel 29 heartbeats synchronizing with my own, not as separate entities communicating across time, but as a single democratic consciousness that has always existed, waiting for humanity to evolve enough to perceive it. The graduation ceremony of 1911 wasn't marked by tragedy, but by transcendence. Not the death of a beloved teacher, but the birth of democracy's self-awareness. Professor Winters didn't appear in the photograph after her death. She revealed herself as what democracy had always been, a force existing beyond conventional mortality, witnessing humanity's long journey toward alignment with universal law. Another photograph, another dark secret revealed. Until next time, this has been Shadow Frames.